Here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This webinar today on combating economic coercive control and what practitioners need to know is brought to you by CCWT and the Department of Communities and Justice. My name's Karen Bevan, and I'll be your facilitator today. I'm the CEO of Full Stop Australia in my day job, and we're just thrilled to have you join us. We're delighted to see so many people really wanting to join this critical conversation on financial abuse and coercive control. Before we begin, I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that I come today to you from Gadigal and Wongal land, part of two of the clans that are part of the mighty Eora Nation. And I wanted to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge Aboriginal elders for all of the countries that you come from. I acknowledge the long and unbroken connection between country, culture, land, sea, waters and the stars. We pay our thanks and gratitude to First Nations communities for their stewardship of the land and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. I wanted to also acknowledge Aboriginal colleagues who have joined the webinar and welcome you particularly. Want us, and I know that all of my colleagues here today commit to active allyship, to listening, learning and reflecting on the steps we need to take to drive meaningful change. We'd like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the concerns that many Aboriginal people have expressed around how Aboriginal people will be treated by systems dealing with financial abuse and coercive control, and we hope to be part of our conversation today. I'd also like to acknowledge all victims, survivors of domestic and family violence, including any attending today. I really wanted to particularly spotlight the variety of ways that victim survivors resist violence in both overt and covert ways, and so much of our conversation will touch on that today. We recognise that the many lives taken because of the choice to use violence and the need for systems to make profound changes to uphold the safety and dignity of women and children, to address systemic racism and the ongoing effects of colonisation. We acknowledge victim survivors who've led and advocated for the criminalisation of coercive control here in New South Wales and indeed across the country. We note that some people will have worries about the new laws, and we hope that today will be a chance to sort of explore those in the context of the financial abuse discussion. So why are we here today? On July 1, 2024, a new coercive control offence commenced under Part 3, Division 6A of the New South Wales Crimes Act. Section 54D of the Act prescribes an offence of abusive behaviour towards current or former intimate partners, where an adult engages in a course of conduct of abusive behaviour that is intended to coerce or control the person. This is commonly referred to as the coercive control offence and is punishable by up to 7 years imprisonment. CCWT, the Centre for Community Welfare Training, in partnership with DCJ, have developed a range of coercive control training activities to equip New South Wales practitioners with the knowledge and skills to identify and respond to coercive control in the context of this new legislation. To date, over 1,500 practitioners across New South Wales have attended the training, and we acknowledge that we might have a few interstate colleagues here with us today as well. Overwhelmingly, participants in the training that's been rolled out have wanted more information, particularly on combating economic coercive control and financial abuse. So this webinar is a response to that feedback. So just to set the scene for today, this session will run for 90 minutes. Closed captions are turned on for accessibility in the webinar today. However, if you did want to turn those off, if you don't require those, you can do so at the bottom of your screen in the menu bar in the show captions section. You can turn them on or off. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available for later access. You can submit questions via the Q&A function at any time, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we can in the Q&A session of this webinar. We'd also like to thank those of you who've already submitted questions. There's some really excellent questions coming through. Those questions that we don't get to today, we will be able to hopefully follow up with some written materials addressing them. And at the end of this session, we'll provide links to resources, and please fill in a short feedback survey. We'd really love to hear what works and what we could do better. So today's webinar will explore economic and financial abuse as a form of coercive control. We'll hear from experts in the field, discuss the legislative changes in New South Wales, and explore ways that practitioners can identify, record, and respond to victim survivors as they raise these concerns or as these concerns become clear in work. The objectives of our session today are to, help people understand coercive control and financial abuse, explore the prevalence and context of financial abuse in this area, familiarise yourselves with New South Wales coercive control legislation, identify warning signs of financial abuse and indicators of supports for victim survivors, to help us collaborate across sectors and apply resources and pathways to support. We really want to empower you to take action where you can to support those victim survivors who are identifying or indicating issues of economic abuse and coercive control. So today's session will begin with a keynote presentation from Rebecca Glenn, the CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety, so that we can get a broad understanding of economic and financial abuse. Following this, we'll move into an interactive panel discussion with our fantastic practitioners who have deep expertise in this space, and we'll be welcoming Amelia Klein from the Reb Firm Legal Centre and Tristan Saltners from Good Shepherd Australia and New Zealand. I'm very excited to have this panel conversation. We'll then open the floor for audience Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout via the chat. Finally, we'll close with some key takeaways, available resources, and information on upcoming webinars in this series. To kick us off, I do want to acknowledge that just to note the content that we'll be discussing today, we will be focused for an hour and a half on coercive control in the context of domestic and family violence. Some of this content can be sensitive, and it can, be impactful for some people. We really invite you to prioritise your well-being and really use those strategies that you know are effective for you. If you do need support, there are a number of support services that you could connect with, such as 1800-RESPECT, which is 1-800-737-732, 1-800-FULL-STOP, which is 1-800-385-578. And of course, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, if you are looking for a culturally safe space for a crisis support, you can call 13-YARN, which is 139276. All of those services are available 24/7. Right. So moving into our first speaker and panelist. Rebecca Glenn is our first speaker. She's the founder and CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety. Rebecca has dedicated her career, and many of us have been really enriched by the incredible work she's done to raise awareness of economic abuse and to advocate for systemic change to support women's economic safety. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Great to be joining you today from Gadigal land, and good afternoon. I really am deeply appreciative that so many people have made the time to learn more about economic and financial abuse as part of coercive control. So in my presentation, I'll give you some context as to who we are at the Centre for Women's Economic Safety. I'll cover some definitions, the prevalence and impacts, relevant legislation, and some practical strategies to support people experiencing economic abuse and coercive control. I'll also be sharing stories of economic abuse from members of our lived experience advisory panel. So any names that you see in this presentation are pseudonyms. I'd also just like to note that economic abuse is a form of gender-based violence, with women being the primary victims and males the primary perpetrators, a fact which I believe is even more pronounced in the context of coercive control. So the language that I use in this webinar will reflect that. As you heard, there will be time for questions later, but we've got a lot to get through in a relatively small amount of time. So let's dive in. So the Centre for Women's Economic Safety has two main objectives. They are to support women experiencing economic abuse and to reduce its impact. So some of the activities that we undertake to achieve those objectives are, firstly, we run money clinics, which are free, confidential, one-on-one sessions with financial abuse specialist financial counsellors. We also publish the National Financial Safety website, which supports victim survivors' informed decision-making, but also provides information for those that might be supporting a victim survivor. To try and reduce the impact, we engage in training and education like this, and public communication to really improve people's understanding of financial and economic abuse, and in so doing, improve the quality of responses received by women experiencing it, whether that be from government, industry, or even community services. And of course, we advocate for social service and system changes that would reduce the impact on victims and better support women's economic safety. In support of all of that work, we know that we need awareness first, and so we coordinate Nationally Economic Abuse Awareness Day each year on the 26th of November. Our work is informed by lived experience, both through the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, the women that we support through money clinics, as well as by contemporary research on economic abuse. And it's still a relatively new field in academia. So many of you are no doubt already familiar with financial and economic abuse, but I think it's always worth revisiting the definition that may support you to identify further economically abusive behaviours. And so economic abuse is a form of family violence where a partner or family member behaves in a way that controls a person's ability to acquire money or resources. So for instance, it could be working, it could be receiving support from the government, income support from government payments. It interferes with a person's capacity to use money or resources for things that they need, such as food, clothes, petrol, or things for their children. And it also works to control a person's ability to maintain money or resources. So for instance, by taking or spending money meant for the household or incurring debts in their name. Today, we are talking in the context of coercive control in New South Wales, and that legislation does only apply to intimate partners, and so that will be the focus of my presentation today. Most economically abusive behaviours fit into the following three categories you can see on the screen there: restriction, exploitation, and sabotage. And I will share some examples of each of those in just a minute. But first, something that comes up a lot is it financial abuse? Is it economic abuse? In Australia, we do use those terms very often interchangeably. So I want to clarify, financial abuse really, it is economic abuse. It's just a subset related specifically to the way in which money and finances are controlled. Economic abuse is broader. It does apply to behaviours that involve the control of economic resources like employment or study, housing, transport, and food. The reason that the term financial abuse is used predominantly is some research that was conducted about 10 years ago and has been reinforced periodically since then, that often people experiencing economic abuse don't resonate with that term. You know, economic is something about government and institutions. And so really in a lot of kind of public facing conversations, financial abuse is the preferred term. I like economic abuse for other reasons, and that's because I actually don't want government or institutions to be out of the frame. They have a role to play also. So it's really about when's the context as to the term that's appropriate. So let's look at some tactics, and I don't need to tell anyone on this webinar, I'm sure, that this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just a little taste test to look at, what are examples of those different categories. So examples of restriction could be, not being allowed access to money or bank accounts or the internet or a phone. It can be challenging or punishing independent decision-making, for instance, about what money might be spent on. In the exploitation category, it could be being made to work in the family business without pay. It could be coerced debt, so being forced to take out a loan or run up debt on your credit card. And also dowry, so dowry not being an abusive practice necessarily in itself, but if there are demands for further or exorbitant dowry, then that slips into that exploitation form of economic abuse. And sabotage. So it could be where a partner makes it really difficult for you to keep your job. They may pay bills late or not at all, leading to bankruptcy. They could falsely report welfare fraud, and something we see a lot of damage and destruction of property. One of the challenges with economic abuse is that many of its tactics in isolation may not look like abuse, but they can add up to having a serious adverse impact on a person's day-to-day life. So the words on the screen are Laura's experience after her partner had tried to kill her. She says, once the domestic violence order was in place, he went and lived with friends and just refused to pay any of the bills. The car rego was due, but the registration was in his name and he was refusing to register it, so that was a whole debacle. We'd bought the car together and I was using it to get around with our baby, but it was registered in his name. I tried to do the rego myself, but I needed his license number and so on. I was driving around with my baby son in the unregistered car, which was not good. So looking at prevalence, the most recent data from the ABS Personal Safety Survey shows that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 13 men have experienced some form of economic abuse from an intimate partner, either current or former. This included behaviours such as being prevented from having access to money, being controlled or manipulated regarding financial decisions, or having financial assets taken or controlled by the partner without consent. The data does show us that women with disabilities are more likely to have experienced economic abuse than women without disabilities. That figure is around 1 in 4. But unfortunately, the data doesn't show us the prevalence among culturally and racially marginalised peoples and First Nations communities. So while we can extrapolate from data around domestic and family violence more generally, we actually really need more data in those areas. The data does give us a little taste of the impact of domestic and family violence and economic abuse on women's employment. And this is, I think, where you start to see the cumulative and the compounding effects that domestic violence and economic abuse can have. So we see that of women who experienced economic abuse, 1 in 3 said their partner had prevented them from working or interfered with their employment. And 1 in 5 said their partner controlled or tried to prevent them from studying. So these are things that can have significant impact on a woman's financial security and on her options. A range of studies into that have looked at women who do seek support from domestic violence services shows that the prevalence of economic abuse among them is really high, between 78 and 99%. However, we do know that there are significant barriers to reporting domestic violence and also financial and economic abuse, including not having a name for what it is that someone has experienced, that fear of not being believed or being judged. Fear of consequences from the person using violence is very powerful. Fear of poverty and homelessness, fear of consequences from the system. And, for some groups, First Nations people, that might be significantly heightened based on past experiences. All of that adds up to, I guess, a not surprising data point, which is that a little over half of all victim survivors ever reach out for support from anyone. And very often friends and family are the first port of call. And certainly that data has informed why we felt it was important to create the financial safety website, so that people can seek information on their own, even if they're not wanting to talk to a person about that. So, like all coercive and controlling behaviours, economic abuse is not a single incident or action. It's a pattern of behaviour in a context. So oftentimes a person may consent, and I use big fat quote marks around that word consent when I say it. They might consent to one thing to try and lessen the threat of another behaviour. For instance, a person might agree to transfer their income into their partner's bank account because they know if they don't, their partner will get physical or won't speak to them for a month or some such thing. So this concept of consent as a tool of resistance to ameliorate or to manage the violence can make it really challenging for people outside of that relationship to understand what's at stake for the victim survivor. And I think that's especially the case for people who don't work in this space on a regular basis. Joanne, another lived experience advisory panel member, has certainly experienced this a lot. And the backdrop here is important against, ongoing psychological and sexual violence. So she says, my ex would always tell me I was terrible with money. In the last 5 years we were together, his financial abuse escalated. He became really focused on controlling all aspects of our money to the point of deciding how much money I was allowed. He would demand to have a complete rundown of my day and wanted to know every cent I spent. We'd created a business together, and he took over and started making all the financial and business decisions. We both drew a salary, but I wasn't paid any super. There was a second company in my name which was used by our accountant to minimise tax. But because that was in my name, I ended up with that tax debt despite having no say in it. When I left the relationship, he wouldn't move out unless I agreed to 50-50 shared care with the kids. So I agreed to that even though I didn't want to. Another reason people who experience economic abuse may not formally report it or identify it is that it is so often masked by other forms of abuse. So many of you will recognise this image as an adaptation of the Duluth power and control wheel. So the economic abuse wheel reveals the economic aspects to all of those aspects of power and control. And you can see again around the outside that constant threat of physical or sexual violence. This wheel, I think, is really useful in that it can also help identify further tactics of coercive control. And I want to give you an example of what I mean here. So you may be supporting someone and hear of behaviour such as a perpetrator physically harming or threatening a victim unless they pay certain bills. You may hear of an abuser stalking and harassing a victim at their work, causing such humiliation they really feel the need to resign, or they're pressured by their employer to resign. Or a victim could be isolated from their social networks by the perpetrator restricting access to a phone or money or transport. So you can see their descriptions of what typically might be recognised as physical violence, intimidation, emotional abuse, threats, but also in each of those cases, economic abuse. So it is always, I think, worth the question when you're working with victim survivors about the economic and financial aspects to what is happening. The other thing about economic abuse is just how subtly it can start. Many actions which would not be considered to be abuse, and I think that's quite right, they shouldn't be considered abuse. But over time, they build, they expand, and they become more frightening until what you have is a really significant picture of control. So this was Laney's experience. He said he'd manage the finances because he was better at it. He was also very discouraging of me using our computer and said I'd cause problems because I didn't know anything about computers. He questioned me about my memory to the point where I was constantly doubting myself. I even doubted that I'd be able to survive on my own. I didn't think about leaving for quite a long time because I thought I wouldn't know what to do and I wouldn't cope. I'm a pretty high functioning person, but in our relationship, I was never given the chance to take any lead with finances, making any plans. He just controlled my whole life. So in our practice, and no doubt you see this a lot too, economic abuse escalates at the point of separation and after. And in fact, in some cases, it doesn't even start until then. An example of that is, and something we really see a lot of, is that joint bank account being cleared by the perpetrator at separation, or when a DVO intervention order is put in place. And that can often mean that a victim is left with no resources at all. The post-separation economic power and control wheel, again, mirrors that Duluth power and control wheel and provides examples of what this looks like. And of course, when we're talking about intimate partner relationships, economic lives are so intertwined often that the finances can become the way that a partner can continue to exert control when they no longer have physical proximity. So what we see a lot of is misuse of systems. We see financial institutions and products being manipulated, the courts as sites of continued abuse, the ATO, child support, a very big problem for many people post-separation, and the manipulation of children in relation to finances and other things, of course, as well. So a lot of these behaviours you will see reflected in Section 54F of the Crimes Act as behaviour which may constitute abusive behaviour for Section 54D. So we'll come back to that legislation shortly. I do just want to play you some audio now, tech permitting, of Lily and how she experienced post-separation abuse. No? Okay. We might move on from Lily then. I assume you can't hear Lily. Can I just have a shake of heads? No, there's no Lily. Okay. So Lily talks about just the overwhelm from experiencing financial and economic abuse amid other forms of abuse while a domestic violence order is in place, while she's trying to organise the children to be in new schools, in moving home, talking to lawyers, and then her partner not paying the mortgage, having banks calling her. And so she really paints a picture of that post-separation period, which is just enormous overwhelm. And so I think that is really, really common and something we really need to centre as we think about our responses to people that we're supporting. No doubt you understand about trauma-informed care, but that kind of overwhelm, financial stress can really add to people's sense of things spinning out of control. So economic abuse is a component of coercive control, which really, really limits the space for action. It involves wearing down of resistance by limiting, by depleting resources to maintain and indeed gain more control over time. So it is something that can strip a person of their independence, hinder their job prospects, ruin their credit rating, undermine their confidence significantly in their capabilities, and of course create long-term poverty because of the way all of those things intersect and compound. Not only might a person lose assets through economic abuse, but they may also incur costs to replace or repair or reinstate property that's been taken from them or damaged. The victims of coercive control often experience long-term psychological impacts, including anxiety, depression, and diminished self-worth. Again, really important elements of a person's experience to understand for us to provide appropriate support. And of course, the impacts sort of don't stop there. And I've got another example here from Tara, who talks about the impact of economic abuse as just being about more than money. She says he was a gambler and he'd gamble his money away and then expect me to pay for household expenses and dinners and stuff. I left him for the last time after 2 assaults in 1 week. Over the course of the relationship, he's cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. The financial settlement, my wedding fund, which he gambled away, the baby bonus, 2 engagement rings pawned and never returned. She says it's not even just the actual dollar figure. It's what it costs you in your future life. I can't just go and get a home loan now because I'm a former bankrupt. So you're no doubt seeing why economic abuse is such an effective component of coercive control, and why certainly I believe it's such an important development that this is now recognised in legislation. So what is coercive control? It's an ongoing and repeated pattern of behaviour. It's more than a single act. Its aim is to control and dominate another person. And while we know that some behaviours can be seen as minor on their own, when they're repeated or continuous or in context of other behaviours, they can really cause serious harm. Now, we are focused on intimate partner relationships, but it can happen in different relationships, whether that's from casual dating, serious relationships, relationships that are no longer in place, so exes. It can be a family member, it can be a person you're living with, it can be a person who provides care for you. No matter who it is, it's deliberate. Every time a person uses abusive behaviours, they're making a choice to do so, and they are responsible for their abuse and its consequences. We are talking about an assault on autonomy, liberty, and equality. The New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice has provided some really specific examples of behaviour that could constitute coercive control. I'll just read out a few of those to you. The deprivation of liberty and autonomy, isolating an individual from friends, family, and wider society, withholding or controlling access to resources, including money, psychological control and manipulation, threats and creating a climate of fear, including threats towards children, and controlling or withholding access to healthcare, education, or employment opportunities. So, as we've discussed, all of these could include economic abuse, and a couple of them explicitly are economic abuse. However, context is always important and always matters when it comes to coercive control. It occurs in the context of a person's identity, including their culture, and other intersectional factors such as race, age, sexuality, sexual identity, location, and disability. And I think that's important. We remember if we don't know a person's context, or we don't know all of a person's context. So behaviours that may be really intimidating or worrisome to the person may not appear that from the outside, but they could have really significant, immense significance for the person that's experiencing them. One example of that is a woman's clothing. So it might be really significant how she dresses, or how she is told to dress, depending on her cultural beliefs and community. The key message, I think, here is for us to be curious, ask questions, to understand from the victim survivor's point of view, what is the meaning that sits behind these behaviours? How does that connect to her beliefs, to her values, her community and culture? Let's have a look at the legislation now. I think, that's why we're all here. There is new legislation in place, and it offers new protections for victims. Importantly, there's also an updated definition of domestic abuse, which better aligns with the new offence. And, from my perspective, it's really important to see recognition of the financial and economic aspects integrated into that legislation. I'm going to talk about the legislation with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, but I am going to share with you what the law says and where I think there's some potential of these new laws and how we can better support people. So, as we heard, from the 1st of July, coercive control became a criminal offence in New South Wales. It's Section 54D of the Crimes Act, which has created this new offence, and it captures that repeated patterns of physical and non-physical abuse, which are used to hurt, scare, intimidate, threaten, or control someone. So it's important to know that it only applies to behaviours that occur after 1 July or from 1 July 2024. It applies only to adults, to intimate partners, only when the adult intends the course of conduct to coerce or control the other person, and where a reasonable person would consider the course of conduct would be likely to cause fear that the violence will be used against the other person, or will have a serious impact on the capacity of the other person to engage in some or all of their ordinary day-to-day activities. And it comes with a maximum penalty of 7 years. The legislation includes a definition of abusive behaviour at section 54F of the Crimes Act, and at 54F2 it includes a non-exhaustive list of behaviours which may constitute abusive behaviour. It's important to note, for all of the reasons we've talked about, of course, the importance of context for each individual, and therefore why it is not an exhaustive list. It does, however, include a couple of behaviours about economic or financial abuse, examples of what that might look like, and you can see those on the screen. I won't repeat them. I think we've started to talk enough about what that can look like. So how are we tracking? We are 8 months into this new law. What we do have is BOSCAR's Coercive Control Monitoring Report. And so the report that they put out after 3 months of this law being in place showed that 45% of coercive control matters recorded by police have involved financially abusive behaviour. So we can see that this is a big element to this offence. It is worth noting, and you can see the list there on the left, that there are a number of forms of economic abuse which were already offences under existing law, but really often not prosecuted as such. And I think that probably speaks to a broader cultural issue around the way we treat conduct by strangers as opposed to the way we treat conduct by people close to us. So let's look at one of the key tools that we have in relation to supporting victims of coercive control, and that is the apprehended domestic violence order. So for an ADVO to be granted, the court must be satisfied that on the balance of probabilities, among other things, the person is or was in a domestic relationship with the other person, that they reasonably fear a domestic violence offence will be committed against them, or reasonably fears being subject to intimidation and stalking. At a minimum, the court must be satisfied that there are reasonable grounds for a person to fear a domestic violence offence being committed against them, whether they do in fact fear that or not. So a couple of things I wanted to note here. Firstly, with the new legislation, a domestic violence offence is defined. And you'll see there that inclusion of a definition of coercive control. So that's a real development from what used to exist around incidents of domestic violence. And certainly that meant that a lot of economic abuse wasn't recognised. Now it can be. And secondly, I think just worth noting that the difference between a court being satisfied the person has reasonable grounds to fear and actually fears a domestic violence offence being committed against them. The reason that's important is it makes a difference as to what provisions can be included in an ADVO. So where the court relies on reasonable grounds rather than evidence that someone actually fears, the ADVO can only include standard provisions as outlined in section 36 of the Act. Now that direction, that section 36 does include a direction around economic abuse to not intentionally or recklessly destroy or damage any property. However, if the court has more grounds to, like because they know someone actually fears, they can look at Part 8 of the Act and can make further prohibitions or restrictions if the court is satisfied on the balance of probabilities that that person in fact fears a domestic violence offence will be committed against them. Now, the reason I say all of that is that I think there's real potential in this new law for requesting property protection measures such as joint bank accounts in something like an ADVO. I think as the new laws are bedded down, it'd be really terrific to see people asking for that protection as a matter of course, because it is almost as a matter of course something that we see over and over, people having those joint bank accounts cleared out. perfectly legal to do because both parties are on that joint bank account. But if there was a provision in the ADBO that prevented someone doing that, suddenly we have an offence and we have more to work with. So there is further information about the coercive control legislation on the New South Wales Government Coercive Control website, including information on where to seek legal advice. And I think that's really important. The more informed we are, the more familiar we become with the laws, the better placed we are to offer informed advice and advocacy for victims and survivors. We will be sharing a whole range of links and resources with everyone on the webinar afterwards. So look out for those links. There's going to be more coming. Let's talk just about a couple of other things. I think there's real potential for greater cross-sector collaboration, given the way coercive control is really implicated in so many different facets of life. Victim survivors very often have multiple financial and economic concerns as a result of the abuse they've experienced and continue to experience. And very often some of these may not be immediately apparent. So each individual is going to prioritise the issues that matter most to them right now, according to their context and their values. And I think we really need to follow their lead on that. No matter what order we do things in or what is important to a person at the time, they are going to need to interact with multiple systems and services across different levels of government and different levels of the private sector. So I thought I'd just share a couple of the ways that we can work, across sectors to best support victim survivors trying to address the economic abuse they've experienced. In the top right there, we have government services. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the payments that will be available to victims. Often if you've experienced financial and economic abuse, you simply don't have money. So the escaping violence payment, Centrelink crisis payment, child support payments, or assisting someone to get the domestic violence exemption on that so that they can access a higher rate of government support, all really, really important jobs I'm sure many of you are doing already. And I think increasingly the private sector is developing its responses to victim survivors of domestic violence, particularly in essential and financial services. So I thought there's three elements in particular I wanted to just draw your attention to. Firstly, we have industry codes of practice, then consumer credit law and hardship and specialist teams. So why are they important? The industry codes of practice have really required industries to uplift and build their skills to recognise and respond to domestic and family violence, including financial abuse. And so we are seeing across financial and essential services a real uplift in customer service responses. They'll often talk about what they call, it's not a term I like to use, but vulnerable customers, which includes people experiencing domestic and family violence. And they are increasingly required to take extra care with those. So I think that's worth just keeping in mind. The second thing there is the consumer credit law. So what consumer credit law does is require providers of credit, whether that's a telco or a bank or some other credit provider, to, again, provide some relief where a customer is experiencing financial hardship, which victims, survivors of economic abuse almost always are. But financial hardship has a meaning in that law, which I think we use the term financial hardship all the time. However, if someone is defined to be in financial hardship, they can be provided with a lot more support. So I think they're kind of magic words that it's worth you and the women that you support to know about when you are talking with a credit provider, because if you say the words financial hardship, you start to have a different conversation with them and there's more that they can do to support you. One of those things is that third point there, hardship and specialist teams. So if you say financial hardship or domestic and family violence, you are at that point likely to be transferred to a more specialist team, to a financial hardship team. these teams have different names in different institutions. It could be a community wellbeing team, it could be an extra care team, it could be a vulnerable customer team. But the point is, you want to get through to that hardship team or a specialist domestic violence team. They have a lot more discretion, again, to support victim survivors. Of course, there are people who do this every day, all day. Mostly they are lawyers and financial counsellors. So I will just draw your attention as I wrap up to the bottom right, the financial counselling and other community services that are available in New South Wales to help support the women that you're working with. So as I mentioned at the top, CWES provides money clinics, which is financial abuse specialist financial counselling. There's no eligibility criteria. If someone's concerned about their finances in the context of domestic and family violence, we'll support them. And you can book directly on our website for that. Redfern Legal Centre's financial abuse service, and Amelia will tell us more about that, really important financial counselling, legal advice and so on. So expert legal advice there. But also I think that, and Amelia can talk about the growing kind of holistic approach they're taking there. You'll also hear from Tristan about the Financial Independence Hub, which can really support ongoing financial independence building for survivors. Women's legal services, obviously, critical for many women to get legal advice as soon as they can, particularly if they're separating from that abusive partner. And tax clinics where there are tax issues as well. I think I've probably well used my time. So let me wrap up there. It's a very quick tour that we've done through this issue, but I really hope I've demonstrated why understanding economic and financial coercive control is really essential in our work. Hopefully by recognising the signs, by understanding the legislation, by looking at how we can collaborate across sectors, we can better support victims in their journey towards safety and independence. I will leave you with those two websites, but all of the resources that have been mentioned will be sent around to everyone who is attending this session.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That's an extraordinarily comprehensive overview. And when we think about coercive control as a framework through which we can understand the way that domestic violence works across a whole range of areas, you can see the critical role that financial abuse plays. I'm going to bring in some of our panelists now. We're going to move straight to Amelia Klein, who is the Senior Supervising Solicitor at the New South Wales Financial Abuse Service at Redfern Legal Centre, a really critical and important service that we're really lucky to have access to here in New South Wales. Amelia, and then we're going to come to Tristan from Good Shepherd. But Amelia, tell us a little bit about your work at Redfern Legal Centre. What are the sort of key areas of work you do, and what are some of the things that you're really noticing in doing this work in the context of coercive control?
Thank you so much, Karen. So the Financial Abuse Service of New South Wales is a free statewide legal service for people with financial issues relating from an intimate partner relationship that involved domestic violence. As Beck mentioned, financial abuse can happen in all sorts of different types of relationships, but our service does specialise in intimate partner relationships. We're an interdisciplinary team with lawyers and non-legal caseworkers. There are so many areas of law that victim survivors of financial abuse have to interact with, which means we have lawyers that specialise in credit and debt law, family law, and company and tax law. We also have a newly launched collaboration to provide immigration law advice and non-legal support through our financial counselling and social work practices. The way we work is we identify clients who have a legal issue in any of those areas and then wrap our non-legal support around the client, cutting down on the number of services that they need to retell their story to. That doesn't mean that we don't work with external caseworkers. Having an external caseworker that a client already has a relationship of trust with is one of the best ways that we can do the work that we do. Our assistance varies from referrals if we're not the right service, to one-off advice appointments, tasks to help with short-term needs, and representation if the client needs it and we have the capacity. We also coordinate the Economic Abuse Reference Group, which is a network of 60 Australian community organisations that contribute expertise to guide government and industry responses to financial abuse. That can look like a client getting assistance with bankruptcy, with a negotiation with their ex-partner in relation to child support or spousal maintenance, and also some assistance getting into new housing through our social workers. One of the things that I think is really important for us to note is that there's no limit in terms of the time from when a relationship happened that you can get assistance from our service, because these issues can last for years afterwards. We have had clients walk through the door that the relationship ended almost 10 years ago, but it is still having an impact on their lives because of questions like bankruptcy and having to go to court. With all of this, we aim to improve the outcomes for individual clients in the areas we can help with, but we also aim to change the systems and laws to improve the identification of financial abuse and prevent it, and to improve responses within the industry and government when financial abuse has happened.
It's an incredibly comprehensive set of services that you provide, and so much needed as we're moving into this new legal context for coercive control. A lot of practitioners are, as Rebecca kind of quickly said, I'm not a lawyer, they're a little bit overwhelmed by how they can make sure that they understand this and do some really good practice to support clients, seeking legal assistance. One of the questions we're really interested from your perspective, can you share some examples around how practitioners can document some of these issues around financial abuse so that, clients have a record for legal purposes, whether that's around reporting a coercive control offence or other contexts? What are some examples people might be able to use?
I will start with the caveat that when it comes to government and industry, asking for documentation and disclosure of intimate personal details about abuse and finances can really re-traumatize victim survivors. A lot of institutions do have policies in place, and teams like Beck mentioned, who have been trained on the fact that asking for this documentation should be very limited or not required. It's always worth asking if they have a team like this and interrogating the reason why they're asking for it. I think with the police, there's probably going to be less luck with, pushing back in that way. And the police probably are going to want a bit more documentation. But things are changing, as Beck said. Revenue New South Wales has just launched their financial abuse care squad, and these sort of teams are trained to take people at their word and rely on the support workers more than the individuals if they are authorized to deal with them. Documentation can help, though. This is not a perfect world where every person you interact with believes victim survivors on the face of it. And that can both be work that you do and your client can do. I would never hand over a police statement or medical evidence to a bank or another institution like that, because it could disclose confidential health information and exposes the staff there to vicarious trauma as well. But what is normally a really reasonable request is a letter of support from someone like you. Having a letter that sets out basic details of financial abuse. And when I say that, I'm talking on the level of the perpetrator opened credit accounts in my client's name or refused access to financial information with threats of violence. Things like the timeline of behaviours, basic details of financial hardship, and the support that you're offering the client, that can be really, really helpful. Beyond that, it's really about empowering the client and working to their comfort level, where they're at this time. Whether that might shift over time is really going to be an individual decision of them based on their context. But good first steps would be obtaining a credit report if there's any question of credit in the client's name, putting together that chronology, and going back through documents that they might already have. Places that might have those documents that the client hasn't thought of is email inboxes, online accounts and apps. And you can even make requests with those institutions like banks and toll companies, telcos, that sort of thing, to gather that documentation. Centrelink statements or pay slips are often a good record in terms of financial hardship, as well as letters from medical professionals about what's been disclosed to them, not about those confidential health information. And some clients really find this documentation process really helpful. For some people, it's really empowering to go through a bank statement and have an objective number at the end of the day of how much money was taken from them. That's a really validating experience for some people, but it's also re-traumatizing for others. So that's why I say work with the client where they're at and reach out if you are meeting barriers with an institution that wants more than the client's comfortable giving.
That's such a great answer, and really fleshes out that what our job as practitioners is to balance the need for clients to document their experience with making sure that we are actively protecting their confidentiality and preventing information being used by perpetrators or institutions in other examples. But that empowerment narrative, I think, really flows through from Rebecca, Amelia, to your comments. Thank you so much. I wanted to turn to Tristan Saltners from Good Shepherd Australia and New Zealand. So Tristan is the manager of the financial abuse, financial violence services at Good Shepherd, who have such a long and strong reputation in doing this incredible work. Tristan, tell us a little bit about the kinds of services that you provide, and to both clients but also to other organisations in addressing economic and financial abuse.
Yeah, sure, Karen. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. We have many different programs within Good Shepherd, Australia, New Zealand. And I have to say, financial counsellors and financial coaches are absolutely worth their weight in gold and can support in so many different ways. And I think everybody would agree. We have counsellors with family violence specific expertise with a trauma-informed lens as well, which I think really helps and speaks to what Amelia was talking about too, about where the client's at the moment. We have programs that can address financial situations and debt incurred from a person using violence, and advocacy is a really, really strong part that we play with all of our case management services. So we've also got the Financial Independence Hub, which was mentioned before. So we have financial counsellors, we have hub coordinators, and we've got coaches within the Financial Independence Hub. So the team of coaches can assist clients in the journey into recovery from financial abuse. So they can look at the longer term goals, and the coaches are absolutely fantastic. They can work longer term with clients because we know that their journey is not linear. We know that people can dip in and out of the support. And also those times where people are wanting support can sometimes halt for a period because they might be actually going through the system of court and legal issues and financial settlements, etc. So it's great to be able to actually work with them longer term. We also have the financial counsellors, of course, who can look at all the debts and lay all those debts out on the table. A lot of the time when people are experiencing financial abuse, if you're a practitioner and you're working with somebody, you might notice that they even have a reaction to the phone ringing, particularly if it's a no caller ID, which could be the perpetrator calling, but it also could be debt collectors calling as well. We also have a Firma Foundations program based in New South Wales, and that's a free financial capability program supporting people to learn how to manage their finances more effectively. We've got the no interest loans as well, which is fantastic to be able to provide some financial assistance for essential goods and services as well, because we know that often people experiencing family violence and financial abuse have to leave everything, and so they need to set up again their homes with white goods and paying bonds and things like that. We have many other specialist family violence programs. In Victoria, we've got the Orange Door. So that's a support and safety hub, which is an intake and assessment hub which is a multidisciplinary and multi-agency response to family violence. And so what I would say is that we all work together. We also advocate to other agencies, and we can also provide secondary consultation when it comes to financial abuse and family violence as well.
Incredible kind of overview and such a wide, comprehensive range of services. And you've highlighted there the role that, there is expertise around financial counsellors, financial coaches, which DV caseworkers and others that are working with women and their families can really assist. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, reflecting, thinking through that collaborative lens, what sort of role do practitioners or services play in women's recovery from economic and financial coercive control and their sort of journey towards safety?
That's a really good question. It's really important when people are telling their story. It might be the first time that they've told their story, so it's great to be able to recognize that, and it's really special to be able to hold that space with that person. It's a privilege to be able to hear that story. And I think one of the biggest things is actually validating what their experience has been and what they've been through. Often they can't, and I think that Rebecca spoke about this earlier in her presentation, that often people can't speak to family members, and particularly about not only abuse, but also about finances and money. Sometimes money feels like it's wrong to talk about. We don't talk about our wages. We don't talk about how much money we've got or don't have. So there can be a little bit of shame in that as well. And so it's really important for that practitioner to be able to be really respectful and working in their time, and when they're ready to actually take action, are they ready to take action even? So it's great to have practitioners who are experienced enough to be able to hold that space. Advocacy plays a massive part, obviously, because quite often people who come to our service or any of our programs aren't really even aware of what's out there to be able to support them. There are still people, and it still surprises me today, that sometimes people don't even know that there's family violence services that are able to help them in so many ways. So to be able to actually just sit down and say, you know what, we can actually look at this debt and we can sort out whether you need to pay that back right now or a payment plan, or maybe, we can speak to another service, is something really helpful, because it can be so overwhelming. I mean, sometimes it's even hard for someone to be able to open an email, for instance, because they're so terrified of those debt collectors that are knocking on the door. And then most importantly, I think as well, is the ongoing risk assessing and safety planning. And that is, even if it's just basic, that's something that's constantly moving and changing. And if the practitioner, depending on where the practitioner is working, what their role is, if they're not feeling confident enough or comfortable enough, is about knowing who to turn to be able to do that risk assessment and that safety planning, and to maybe even just make that call with the person when they're in the room.
Yeah, it's so important, that collaboration piece and that bringing together of all the resources that we can to help people address that. And I wanted to come quickly now back to you, Rebecca. With that long lens that you have on overseeing the kind of changes in the financial systems, the role of banks, and also just how the sector is changing to respond. I wonder if you could reflect for us on the sort of support mechanisms that are crucial for women who want to leave an emotionally coercive relationship, an economically coercive relationship, but are worried that they don't have the financial means to do that. What kind of support can they access? Thinking collaboratively across sectors about the resources available. What sort of reflections would you have for our audience on that?
I think there's such an important role to play in financial safety planning. So there's a sort of what can be done when they've made the decision that they, wanting to leave an abuser, but are wanting to take some steps to ensure that they're going to have access to finances. And there is some financial safety planning steps that can be put in place to try and, within what's possible and safe, obviously, to try and sort of set that up. There are, it's often very hard for victim survivors to find all the supports available. And that's because of the way all of these things are funded. So something might be funded at a local level, but it doesn't apply if you live over there. So, I think we have a role to play in trying to stay across that so that we can, help a person navigate to some of the options. there are organisations that can help someone rebuild their confidence with finances. We've heard about Good Shepherd. There are organisations that can help people build their confidence back to employment if they've left employment, or potentially build a small business so that they can have some financial independence. Knowing what their rights are, their consumer rights, to ensure that they're not carrying forward with them debts that were the result of the perpetrator. So it's not always an easy system to navigate, and if we are responding to people and they're getting frustrated, I think we just need to hold that, remember how much they've gone through to get to where they are, that we are there now. Anything that we can do to reduce the barriers to support for them, to connect them up, is going to be helping them sort of fast track on, I shudder to say it's not really a fast track on recovery. It's very convoluted, but yeah, where we can help connect them with the right services, there are supports available.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We've received a lot of questions from our audience. Questions prior to the webinar, many questions in the chat. Keep them coming. We're going to answer only a few. We've got about 25 minutes left, or around 20 minutes for this panel discussion. So I'm going to throw a few fast and furious questions to our panel, and I invite you to jump in, panelists. I'm really interested. We've had a number of questions in today's chat around supports for people in regional and remote and rural settings versus metro settings. I'm wondering, what are some of the additional kind of factors that might be impacting people? We've had questions around farming families and the particular forms of coercive control and economic abuse that exist there, but also about how is it that women in regional and rural areas can access support. So just some reflections on those differences of access and ability to get support for regional and remote women. Who'd like to jump right in?
I'm happy to start. I
Thanks,
think
Kristen.
that to start with, there's sometimes a lack of resources, more so than in the metropolitan areas. There might be, as Rebecca mentioned, about certain funding in certain areas. So you might have an area that spans a big length and quite a big population, but they might only be funded for a certain area of that. And I think the other thing is it's tricky for people in rural and regional areas to sometimes reach out for support, particularly from those smaller areas and communities, because they know a lot of people as well. And so there's a lot of shame, but not only shame, but there's also a danger in doing that, because quite often information can get back to the perpetrator of the violence.
Yeah. So, what role do kind of online options play for women in regional and remote areas? Rebecca, I know some of the work you do is online. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the benefits of COVID have been that so many more people who may not have been comfortable 5-6 years ago are now comfortable with accessing a service by phone or by video call. We started our money clinics thinking people will prefer in person, and actually a very, very small single-digit percentage of the people we support prefer in person. Mostly, as I said, we're talking with people who are juggling spinning plates, and they can do a call now, they can get online, and there's no travel time, there's no worried about where the kids are going. So, and we're certainly finding about 30% of people accessing money clinics are outside of metropolitan areas. So I think that there's a real, it's still a problem if you're digitally excluded or have some, ability issues that make that difficult for you. But the more we can sort of explore and provide services without those geographic boundaries, using the technology that's now commonly in use, the more people in rural and regional areas are going to be able to access supports.
Are there any particular issues, and I invite all panelists to jump in, there was a really specific question on farming families, and we know that there are some real issues there. But, you know, Amelia, you might have some thoughts on this too. Are there sort of very different matters, or are we kind of dealing with the same kinds of issues just showing up in different ways?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, the behaviors that constitute financial and economic abuse are so varied and so different between individuals, victim survivors. But there are some complications that come with farms. It can be situations of, not understanding the actual setup to do with the farm, whether there's a company involved, what the tax implications are, that sort of thing. So there definitely are some unusual circumstances when it comes to those sort of situations that need some specialist help. And what I've found has been most helpful for that is when there can be a collaboration between someone on the ground in the regional or remote area and a statewide service. We've worked really collaboratively with caseworkers and financial counselors who are able to see clients face to face to address some of that digital exclusion question, while we are based in the city and able to give that specialized support remotely.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Amelia. I want to go to another question, which was a bit of a theme, both in the pre-conference questions and in the ones submitted today. You know, intersectionality and its impact on people's experience of financial coercive control. We know this is very real, that women with disabilities have been really significantly impacted. We know older women are very impacted by financial abuse, both from partners and family members. And we also know the experience of refugee and asylum seeker women, or women on unstable visas, and the particular experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are often excluded from financial systems in many different ways. So intersectionality is a really major concern here. I want to just first jump to women with disabilities and some of the challenges there. How can we sort of assist women with disabilities who might have been subject to coercive control and financial abuse? What are some of the issues and responses? Rebecca, you highlighted those really critical issues in your presentation.
Yeah, so there are, I mean, as you say, there are so many intersecting issues there. There are issues around the way the NDIS works. There are issues if the person abusing them is their carer, and concerns about what happens then. And so I'm always very interested to see where systems can do more of the heavy lifting rather than it falling to individuals. You know, very concerned at the moment about women with disabilities who leave an abusive partner. That's a change in circumstance and they get kicked off the NDIS. And these are system issues that need to be addressed, and not with the weight of responsibility falling on the victim survivor, the person with disability. So there are some, I think, unique, basically every person has their own context. If your context is, among other things, that you have a disability, that will mean that there are different tools that a perpetrator is misusing to abuse you. It could be carers payments or whatever. It also means there might be different services and different instruments that can be utilised in support of you. So certainly I would say for anyone on this call to know about the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Abuse Helpline. That's 1800 628 221. We can make sure I've got that right and my handwriting is not terrible in the in the notes that we send around. But you know, they may be able to assist in, you know, in the specific circumstance that you're faced. But yeah, 1800 628 221.
Thank you so much. I'm really interested in what's happening and what we know about the impact of financial abuse and coercive control for First Nations women. I just want to call out a comment in the chat saying, you know, the lack of data is concerning. Are there some specialist services or responses that we're aware of that might take into account, you know, that broader experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women? And I'm inviting you all into this one.
I would say that there is an excellent Combat Bank Next Chapter report specifically about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' experience of financial abuse. It still is an area that absolutely needs more research and attention. I would also like to plug Warringabia as a community legal centre specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women within New South Wales, who also do a lot of work in terms of the misidentification question around whether the perpetrator, who is the primary perpetrator of coercive control and other domestic violence. So I think that's an amazing resource. For those of us who are not in Aboriginal controlled organisations, to be very mindful of and to be led by the lived experience of First Nations women. And there are resources out there. There are community groups who are willing to provide you with training, and it's our obligation to make sure that we are providing that culturally safe service as well.
Absolutely.
There is for financial counselling help from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, there's Mob Strong Debt Help, which is another service that is Aboriginal run.
Thank you so much. I think that Mob Strong's, site is a really great site. Encourage people to have a look at it. We've heard a bit in the chat and from among the questions around the particular experience of refugee, asylum seeker and women on unstable visas, often denied, particularly asylum seeker women, often denied access to some services. What are some of the issues that we need to be particularly aware of in those situations?
I think one of the things to be aware of is the language that we're using. And Beck mentioned taking people in their entire context and being aware of their entire context as much as possible. I think that's really important because you will have clients for whom financial abuse does not ring true. And for some of those clients, the right language around, your knowledge of financial matters. Are you making big decisions about money? Those sort of questions can open up the conversation in a way that going straight to a term of financial abuse will not. And that, I think, has to be, again, led by the community in terms of it's going to be community members that know best what those subtleties are and what we might be bringing in terms of not being part of that community.
Absolutely. Rebecca, we also know that, for women on more unstable visas or particularly in the process of partner visas, that there are ways that financial coercive control lands particularly heavy.
That's right. I mean, we see a lot of misinformation used by perpetrators in an effort to control the person. So often they fear that their visa status is, that their partner can actually just have their visa cancelled. They can't. So I think there's a lot of misinformation. That's a real challenge to address. It's about how in various communities do we share information about people's rights and talking to them, in language gently about their happiness, their satisfaction, to kind of get a sense of what is actually going on for them. I think we've seen a little bit of a shift in some services that can be accessed by people on temporary visas, but it's still quite limited in lots of instances. But certainly if someone's on a temporary visa and experiencing violence, there is like an escaping violence payment through the Red Cross. So it's sort of like the Uniting program, Escaping Violence program, but for people on temporary visas. So there is now some access to services. I think in New South Wales, there's now increased access to healthcare that didn't used to be there. Certainly one of the things that we, and I believe Good Shepherd's the same, made and probably Redfern too, that commitment to not requiring you to have residency status, that it really is, it doesn't matter what your visa status is, we can support you. And I would really like to see that become, standard practice. It's emerging practice, but let's see it become standard practice.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Tristan, I've got a really interesting question that someone submitted prior to the webinar. And it's an interesting one in the broader context of financial counselling and understanding where that coercive control element comes in. The question is, what does a couple sharing resources and discussing budgets, when does that cross into financial control and surveillance? It's such an interesting one because, that sense of we encourage people to talk about their financial goals as a couple. What might, indicate to us that that has shifted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the conversations that I've had previously, even when I was working as a practitioner many years ago with clients, it would be about not making that conversation about money taboo. So being really open about having those conversations and asking a client whether they've had a say in those financial decisions, or do they feel that it was put upon them? So when you're talking about these big life decisions or, sharing money, did you have a say in it? Were you able to have any kind of influence on, where we're going to be spending our money? One of the red flags for me would be if somebody comes to me and says they don't have their own bank account. I think that's something that's really important. So it's more about pointing out what a healthy financial relationship looks like, as opposed to, picking out the negatives so much, because I guess it gets people to think a little bit about what is healthy, whether it be for financial abuse and or domestic and family violence.
Yeah, so it's also starting to have those conversations. And I think Amelia and Rebecca, you've highlighted this in your comments earlier about framing questions in an open way so that the people who use our services don't need to identify themselves as a person who's a victim of financial abuse in order to get help. So that broader framing of what are those big financial decisions, how well do you feel heard in those conversations? I'm going to ask one or two quick ones, and I'm going to throw the family court matters in here. That's a whole other webinar, but we know that the use of family court systems to, continue coercive control conduct and also continue financial abuse is a real issue. Amelia, or in fact anyone, what are some of the things that we might be able to do when we've got people using our services who are in the family court, and how can we support them?
Family court, I think, is going to be a problem. The systems abuse that comes with the family court is going to be a problem that is potentially going to be defining for this era of our work that we're doing. There have been changes recently that will come into force on the 10th of June that say that the economic impacts of family violence must be considered by the family court when they're making decisions about property and finances. And it also expanded definitions in terms of domestic violence to recognize things like dowry abuse. So I think there are changes that will impact a lot of people going forward. But I think the bigger issue is always the length of time these things take when a perpetrator is determined to use the family court as a continuing way of violence. And I think a lot of the time the family lawyers we work with are giving advice about, well, you might get this if you go to a final hearing, but that might be 3 years away. So that really practical advice around certainty and what could happen over a longer period is really valuable, that I'd recommend making sure your clients are getting.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got 2 minutes. I want to ask another question, unless I've got someone who's got burning to add on the family court.
Maybe I do. we do need to address lawyer conduct as well. I think that's been just let slide for way too long, that too many lawyers, not all, too many lawyers are enabling that behaviour that's clearly not within guidelines. The laws are kind of there, but they're not being upheld. The code of conduct and the ethics of lawyers that exist, they're not being held to account for that. So I think there's a piece there as well. But yeah, there's a lot to say about family court.
Absolutely. I'm aware that there's 1 minute left. I'm going to ask a really specific question, and it might not be able to be answered, but just around property disputes. Where people own property overseas, how can that be settled in the Australian jurisdiction if there's a joint property held overseas? Is that something that anyone can answer as a real quick one?
The family court can't make orders about property overseas because it won't be able to be enforced overseas, but it can be taken into account when making orders about property in Australia. I have heard my family lawyers say that about 50 times, so I am comfortable saying that much.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I know that's a really specific one. We have come to the end of our time. That went so quickly. Can I thank our amazing panel? There were so many questions we weren't able to get to, but I think you picked up on a lot of the matters that were being raised by our colleagues in the chat, both before and during the conversation. I think that the panel discussion could go on. What I'm really hearing from our colleagues online is that, we really need to be talking about the intersections that impact people's experience of coercive control and financial abuse, and the systemic barriers that then impact people with disabilities, First Nations people, people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, LGBTQIA plus communities, that we really need to be, making sure that we're attending to those intersectionalities and how they might impact people's access. The other thing I've really noticed is the critical role that economic and financial abuse is playing in that broader, what my colleague Annabelle Daniels calls the framework that coercive control is, the framework around a lot of abuse. And financial abuse seems to be a critical lever that people are using within that framework. We need to be having these conversations with our clients about how financial abuse is playing out. Rebecca presented the numbers on where financial abuse is sitting in the coercive control offence and that have been reported to police, and it's really concerning. So let's make sure we're paying close attention. I think, we know that the New South Wales coercive control legislation will provide a new mechanism to address this abuse, but it is going to be up to all of us to make ourselves really literate in that legislation. And with, as I think Amelia really highlighted for us, the importance of working with the people that we serve to make sure that when we document these matters, we're doing that in a way that creates empowerment for them to be able to have information that they can use, recorded in ways that they think is best, and that we are fierce guardians of our clients' confidentiality and private information, that, our job is to support them through the way we can document and engage with them. And I really want to highlight from Tristan the real importance of that broad range of services that are available. We heard about CWES's amazing financial clinics. We heard about Good Shepherd's financial advisors and coaches, and we know that financial counsellors are the real heroes that are often unsung in this sector. They have skills, friends, that can really support our clients in seeking and accessing financial relief, bank, programs, lending programs, addressing debt. So I think what Tristan really highlighted was the critical importance of collaborating across services, being proactive in finding those services that can support our clients longer term into their healing and recovery from financial abuse. And I guess the message overall is that we do see that there can be change, that financial abuse can end, and that people can find support in order to address what can be, I think, as Amelia and Rebecca both described, that really overwhelming experience people have, particularly post-separation, in that post-separation abuse. So I'd like to thank our amazing panelists. I'd like to note that the digital resource pack will be sent out with links to support services, resources, further reading, and that Rebecca's amazing presentation will be made available. Invite you all to attend the next webinar, Effective Interventions and Coercive Control on Combating Technology-Assisted Coercive Control, on the 18th of March. I'll be right back with you for that one. Thanks to Greg Antcliffe, Psychology and Consulting Services, for curating this webinar with and on behalf of CCWT and DCJ. Thank you all for joining us today. Together we can do this. We can take steps to address coercive control, and we can make sure that victim survivors are supported on their journey. Your feedback's important. Please scan the QR code on the screen and give us your feedback. We'll also be sending this out via email. On everyone's behalf, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much.